Philip Stanley Klein. He's a pretty nice guy.
Stanley Klein, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, just go stack them over there on top of the coffee maker, and maybe can you just give me 1 cup of water, please? Ani rotse kosma bebakasha.
Cookie, your back said.
Don't tell him there's vegetables in
Back said.
Yeah, exactly. As long as I can't see them, it's still healthy. Mr. Brookie, that cup that you just smushed up to your face, I don't want that one.
And then both things on the back of your shirt.
Grab me a new one. And don't put it on your face. Thank you. Yeah, Ralph, can you,
Cookie, I got off your back.
Karen, I want you to really clean these out after we're done here. Yeah, Ralph, can you please, pour these for us? So we are in the last portion of Parashat Metzorah, and that is chapter 15 of Vayikra, book of Leviticus. Sure. Come on, bless.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei mori hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah b'shem Yeshua HaMashiach. Amen. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctified us through his commandments, and has commanded us to be occupied with the issues and engross ourselves with the study of the Torah. We thank you, Father, for this time to do that, to look into your word and to discuss it and to hide it in our heart. Father, to draw that much closer to you, Father. May this time be an acceptable time of worship before you. And it's in Yeshua's name we pray. Amen. L'chaim v'Yeshua. And we have some snacks, so bless Hashem for Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei minei mezonot. Amen. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates various types of foods. In Yeshua's name. Amen.
So we're jumping into chapter 15 here. We're over halfway through Vayikra, 27 chapters. And in this particular chapter, we have 33 verses. I'll go ahead and kick us off. Starting in chapter 15 of Vayikra, book of Leviticus, and verse 1 for Parashat Metzorah, including portion. Hashem said to Moshe and Aharon, "Tell the people of Israel, when any man has a discharge from his body, the discharge is unclean. The discharge is unclean no matter whether it continues flowing or has stopped. It is still his uncleanliness. Every bed with which the person with the discharge lies on is unclean, and everything he sits on is unclean. Whoever touches his bed is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening.
Whoever sits on anything the person with the discharge sat on is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. Anyone who touches the body of the person with the discharge is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. If the person with the discharge spits on someone who is clean, the latter is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. Any saddle that the person with the discharge rides on will be unclean. Whoever touches anything that was under him will be unclean until evening. He who carries those things is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening.
If the person with the discharge fails to rinse his hands with water before touching someone, that person is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. If the person with the discharge touches a clay pot, it must be broken. If he touches a wooden utensil, it must be rinsed in water. When a person with a discharge has become free of it, he is to count 7 days for his purification. Then he is to wash his clothes and bathe his body in running water. After that, he will be clean. On the 8th day, he is to take for himself 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, come before Adonai to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and give them to the Kohen. The Kohen is to offer them, the one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering. Thus the Kohen will make atonement for them on account of this discharge before Adonai.
If a man has a seminal emission, he is to bathe his entire body in water. He will be unclean until evening. Any clothing or leather on which there is semen, it is to be washed with water. It will be unclean until evening. If a man goes to bed with a woman and has sexual relations, both are to bathe themselves in water. They will be unclean until evening. A woman who has a discharge and the discharge from her body is blood, she will be in her state of nidah for 7 days. Whoever touches her will be unclean until evening. Everything she lies or sits on in her state of nidah will be unclean.
Whoever touches her bed is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. Whoever touches anything she sits on is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. As soon as he touches the bed or something she sat on, he will be unclean until evening. If a man goes to bed with her and her menstrual flow touches him, he will be unclean 7 days, and every bed he lies on will be unclean. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not during her period, or if her discharge lasts beyond the normal end of her period, then throughout the time she is having an unclean discharge, she will be as when she is in nidah. She is unclean.
Nope. Every bed she lies on at any time while she's having her discharge will be for her, like the bed she uses during her time of nidah, and everything she sits on will be unclean, and with uncleanliness like that her time of nidah. But whichever touches those things will be unclean. He is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. If she has become free of her discharge, she is to count 7 days. After that, she will be clean. On the 8th day, she is to take for herself 2 doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the Kohen at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The Kohen is to offer the one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering. Thus the Kohen will make atonement for her before Hashem on account of her unclean discharge.
In this way you will separate the people of Israel from their uncleanness, so that they will not die in a state of uncleanness for defiling my tabernacle which is there with them. Such is the law for the person who has a discharge, for the man who has a seminal emission that makes him unclean, for the woman in nidah during her menstrual period, for the person, man or woman, with a discharge, and for the man who has sexual relations with a woman who is unclean.
All right. Any thoughts, questions, insights to share?
It didn't often say, it says there, bathe with water, but only like during the actual time when somebody who had the uncleanness, the discharge, was to for their, purify them, they had to be in running water. But if they were to touch something or something was to touch them, that person, all they had to do was to, bathe in water, and they would clean at evening.
Mm-hmm.
But only one particular time, I think it says, running water. So it's like,
Yeah, that's a good question. For example, in verse 13, it says, when a person with a discharge has become free of it, he has to count 7 days for his purification. Then he has to wash his clothes and bathe his body in running water. After that, he will be clean. And so there it does mention Mayim Chaim, and otherwise, we, for example, have in verse 16, if a man has a seminal emission, he is to bathe his entire body in water. So that's Shichvat Zara, if he has a seminal emission, Ve'erachatz B'mayim, and he shall wash in the water. So there is a definite article there, which is referring to something definite. So I would propose that it's a possibility that because it's referring to something specific and just not any water, that the previous context would be our something that we would fall back to what it's speaking of. And so I think that it's quite likely that in any case it's speaking of this running water, this Mayim Chaim. Because that seems to be a consistent mention throughout. Because if you think about it, I mean, yes, they did have a number of different ways that they could bathe, but if we just think of the context of, during this time, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years after that, where do you think they would be taking these baths?
well, unless they had these, ritual places that they went to, it would probably be in a river somewhere.
Yeah, but even the ritual places would be Mayim Chaim. Those mikvah would be also Mayim Chaim, because they were, when you go to Yerushalayim near the temple, you'll see that they're everywhere around the temple, these man-made ones. They're all,
Right.
it's all Mayim Chaim. But yeah, otherwise, you got rivers, you got ponds, you got lakes, all Mayim Chaim, So, like I said, I think because we have Ba'mayim in the water, technically it's not B'mayim, that it's quite likely speaking of that. It's just because it's mentioned so many times, as I mentioned in Parshat Mitzorah, it's mentioned more times in this parsha than any other portion of scripture, that it might be even redundant to have to say Mayim Chaim every single time. It's because there's a lot of washing going on, between all these people. So I don't know. That's just my thoughts on that.
There's a verse in here that I guess let's see here. Verse 24, it talks about if a man was to lie with her during the time, and if, say, her blood was to get on him, right?
Mm-hmm.
He'll be unclean. And I'm guessing, could this be that it was without his knowledge,
Yeah, I
or,
think that's the context.
but then, because then I know that the verse in Vayikra, Leviticus 20, verse 18, it'll say that, and if a man shall lie with a woman having her sickness, but I think it's just, her nidah time, and shall uncover her nakedness, and he hath discovered her fountain, and she hath uncovered the fountain of her blood, and both of them shall be cut off from among the people. So it's like, instead of both of them, just being unclean for a period of time, now it's they're going to be cut off from their people. So
Yeah, most commentators I've read, including TeNaKh and many of the Jewish sages, they say a very similar thing, that a number of things are happening here. In Vayikra 20, verse 18, it's very specific. They're uncovering. They're uncovering a source of blood that's already there. So it says they both do it. He has exposed the source of her blood, and she has exposed the source of her blood. So there's already a source of blood taking place, which is what's very specific there in chapter 20:18. Back in chapter 15, verse 24, the way it puts it is, if a man goes to bed with her, and her menstrual flow touches him. So, obviously a menstrual flow can happen, in a time when one might not expect it. And so, he goes to bed with her. And this doesn't, although depending on the context, it can refer to sexual relations. It could be simply just laying down in bed with her, because that's literally what the Hebrew says.
Right.
It uses the word for lying down.
Yeah, oftentimes, I guess depending on the text of it, the context of it, when a person's laying down, it could be for, like I said, it could be for sexual relations. Or
Yeah. Context would be king there.
It could be, yeah. So, and I guess you just have to know when it talks about how they're defining it and in which direction they're leaning towards, Because if it's just like, oh, they're just going to lay down and oops, then it's like, oh, no harm done. But if it's like, we have intent here, we have,
Yeah.
And I guess if Leviticus is written in a chronological manner, this verse, in chapter 20 could be, kind of like a further explanation, because maybe, somebody said, well, should we define this further? And, because maybe somebody didn't get to pick the point, and they were pushing this issue, and so now they're saying, no, if you just do this, you're going to get cut off. And previously they weren't strict about it, and so maybe they were doing something, and they were like, oh.
I hear you're saying, but I think what we have here is, I think God's consistent in His mitzvot. He doesn't alter them. Once they're perfect, and once He gives them, they stand. They don't need to change at all. And so I think that what we have here is simply the situation where if a man happens to go to bed with his wife, and unbeknownst to him, her menstrual flow touches him, and it's later discovered that that's the case, he'll be unclean for 7 days. I think that's really the situation there. It's a situation where they're not. I don't think it's communicating that they're having sexual relations here, and obviously. Let's see if we go back to chapter 20. Note how the text also, the translators, the way they understand the Hebrew here. In chapter 20, verse 18, it says, if a man goes to bed with a woman in her menstrual period and has sexual relations with her. V'isha sher ish chav et isha dava v'gila et zata. So we have a deliberate act here, where it's referring to that word there that I just read. Where's that? V'gila means and to uncover. So we don't have that in chapter 15. So this is the idea that he's lying down and he's uncovering. It literally means to denude, remove her clothing. And so this is it's a sexual act. It's within context. The Hebrew is describing something a little bit different there, as opposed to a man which often happens. A man simply lies down to go to bed with his wife. They're not having relations, but she may go into her menstrual period in the middle of the night, or who knows, And so this is just explaining, I think, the situation when that happens. And then we do have very clear information later on in chapter 20 of the other situation, which uses more specific Hebrew to describe what's going on there. But that's a really good question.
I guess because then nowadays, there's such a question will come up with people because they'll say, well, we don't have a temple, and what do we do now? How do we deal with this? This is a pretty concerning issue with some people, and they, rather than just saying, well, I'm not going to worry about it, some people get concerned about it and they ask the question. We don't have a temple, and this isn't necessarily, the the holy temple, or you know,
Right.
where people are coming for offerings and stuff. It's
Exactly.
synagogue, you know, so
Right.
they're not seeing it as, well, you know, we should probably be careful, you know, you do as much as you can, you know.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah, no, I concur with you. Absolutely. We know that all of this in chapter 15 is for one particular point. Now, there can be other obviously I believe there's other significance to it, but the actual point to all of this in chapter 15 is verse 31. If we take a look at what's verse 31, it says, "In this way you will separate the people of Israel from their uncleanliness, so that they will not die in a state of uncleanliness for defiling my tabernacle, which is there with them." So all of these practices are for the purpose of not coming into the Mishkan, into the tabernacle, in an unclean state and thus dying. That's the purpose of it all. So and it's very specific, the Mishkan is the holy Mishkan, spoken of all throughout the Torah here. And obviously that's the context of these practices. Obviously, if you go into your house, which in a sense you can consider a temple, you know, because it's a holy place. You know, you want to make it a holy place, right? Your synagogue is also very much this in the same, I think, in a very similar way. Being the Beit HaMidrash, a house of study, and Beit Hillel, a house of praise, but it is not the holy Mishkan, where you have all the holy utensils. You have the very, you know, Aron Kodesh, the holy ark, you know, as spoken of in the Torah, and so on and so forth. We have all these very, very, very holy items that you do not want to defile with someone that's coming in unclean. So I agree that we should do as much as we can. These are practices that are preparing us for the kingdom of heaven, I believe. The coming kingdom of heaven, they're basic hygiene standards, but again, it's specific to the coming, you know, Beit HaMikdash, the holy temple, which we know will be established again. And here, sit down, buddy. Okay, sit. We know all the nations are going to be flowing to it.
Right.
So this is going to be something that's going to be this chapter of Scripture is going to be very, very important for everybody to be well versed in. Because if you're going up to the mountain of the house of the Lord, which is the Beit HaMikdash, the holy temple, if you go in there to give an offering, or if you go into its area, and you're ritually unclean, the penalty is death. That's going to be pretty important. This chapter is going to be pretty important to understand and to practice. So again, it's kingdom preparation for kingdom living, and. So, but with that in mind, you know, we want to practice as much as possible. At the same time, because I've been asked dozens of times in the last 15 years about, you know, these passages and how we should, how I understand them to observe them, is that we should observe them as best we can. But I don't think that it should get in the way of fellowship, you know, because that's an important mitzvah that we don't want to put to the wayside, especially because we know that the whole purpose of this is so we do not defile the Mishkan.
Right.
So I believe that because this is a practice, it's important, but in my eyes, it's not as important as the Torah mitzvah of fellowship and building community and strengthening relationships. So I think that takes precedent as far as a mitzvah. So for example, if a woman is during her time of neidah, I believe that a man should practice that with her. There should be a brief time of separation where they practice not touching, and that's referred to as the laws of neidah or negiah. Both of them actually. Neidah speaks of the ritual time of the woman's separation. Negiah refers to touch, and so those, you know, we have the very different instructions that we actually see here. That if you touch a woman that's in her time of neidah, you become unclean. If you sit down on anything that she sat down on, you become unclean. But we have to be very careful to understand that you don't become. It's not a sin. That sometimes can be a hard thing to separate in the mind. It's not a sin. Nowhere in the text does it even remotely say that becoming unclean is a sin. It becomes a sin when? When does it become a sin? It has the potential to be sin, but it's not. It becomes sin when they violate verse 31. It only would be a sin if they came into the Mishkan, or they touched something that was, as the Torah described as hekdesh, set apart and holy, that shouldn't be defiled.
I guess when I was reading this, I guess beginning in verse 4 where it says, this particular verse is kind of repeated in different ways, but it says, every bed whereon he who has the discharge lies shall be unclean, and everything he sits on shall be unclean.
That's correct, yeah.
And when I was reading this, I was trying to, read into it using the Blue Letter Bible and, each word, and I was looking at it. Some of the things that I was trying, well, not trying, but I was maybe seeing is that when the other person is, and because sitting on something, it could mean anything. It could mean not just like a chair, it could be a utensil, it could be, and like, wow, sitting on, people get the idea, hey, these are chairs, so this is what they're talking about, right? Well, not necessarily that.
Anything.
It could be anything.
It doesn't say exactly what she's sitting on. It's just anything that.
But this is verse 4, and it's still talking about the man, and so it's if the person is laying on something that he was on, it sounds like it's for the purpose of relations in some way. So it's if a person just like say sat down on the bed, they're not uncovered, and there's nothing that connects them to that. So I was seeing that maybe there's more of a connection to the whole issue of like a sexual relation versus just.
Verse 4, I hear you saying, verse 4 is not, the sexual relations is not the scope. That's actually dealt with later on in the chapter.
Right.
This is actually talking about anything he sits on. It doesn't matter what clothing he's wearing. Anything that the person with the discharge sits on is unclean. But you're right, it doesn't matter what.
Because it's definitely a spiritual thing, because they mention that if he has this discharge, and whatever the discharge touches, it has to be washed with water. Well,
right.
But if he's sitting on a bed, it's completely covered, he's completely covered, and then he sits on another bed over here, and then he sits on this bed over here, sits on all three beds, he's still completely covered, but now each of those beds
has to be cleaned.
They're not clean anymore because he sat on them.
That's exactly right.
So
that's exactly what the Torah is saying.
But initially, the bed that he was on, and he had his discharge on, it was, it was probably a sexual act, and so.
No, that's not the scope of what's here. There's nothing in the Hebrew that would communicate that. Not even the context. In fact, the context would suggest otherwise, because that specific situation is handled later on in the text as we go down to.
So beginning in verse 2, it's not a sexual discharge.
No.
It could just be pus coming out of his hand.
It's exactly right. Or someone that has some type of a disease, whether it be gonorrhea, or go on. It could go on and on. Whether somebody has some type of a boil or pus. Yeah, that's exactly what it's talking about. The first part is just in general handling any type of any discharge, because later on it gets more specific. It talks about the sexual discharges in several different ways.
I guess when I was reading this and I was seeing the enormity of what this is stating here, because one person could contaminate an entire city if they wanted to. And they could be spitting on people.
That's true.
They could be going crazy.
That's absolutely true.
But the main thing is that person stays away.
They'd probably be restrained before too
stay
far.
Away from the temple, right? The main objective is to keep this person away from the temple, because that's what's going to bring the most damage to them and everybody else.
And be aware, and and Hashem's giving us instructions so we can be aware of not only that person, but everything he touches, and how he could transmit that uncleanliness, because then we become unclean as well. And we don't want, again, and then that transfers to us, and we don't want to come into the Beit HaMikdash or the Mishkan in that, that unclean state. But you're right, the Torah is spiritual. These all have, I believe, spiritual applications. But first and foremost, we lay down the Peshat, the literal understanding of what's actually going on there, and then definitely we can take a look at the spiritual understandings there. But so it moves on. So it starts here with a man who has a discharge from his body. I mean, again, it can be anything. It can be, some type of a venereal disease. It can be something like hemorrhoids. It could be a bad case of hemorrhoids. I mean, you could go on and on and on. Any type of a discharge would make somebody unclean like that. And then, of course, we have the instructions. Whoever touches his bed is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. So you just have a single individual in scope so far in these first few verses. Of course, somebody later on that would come along and sit on the bed would become unclean. And then we have, not only that, but he mentioned as the spit, even the spit of the person, which is technically, it's kind of getting specific here. Even spit would be considered a discharge, and if you think about it, it makes sense. Spit being a discharge would be unclean just as any other discharge. And then as we read through some of these things, we see that there's certain items, and this, these are touching on certain basic biblical kashrut standards. That if you have something that's porous like clay, and something unclean falls on it, you can't. There's nothing you can do to make that ever clean again. According to the Torah, you actually do have to break it. Other than that, if it's something that's not clay or some type of a porous type of a situation, for example, wood or maybe another material, then that just needs to be scoured and rinsed, and that will be something that would be clean. So in verse 12, we see about the clay pot, but it mentions the wooden utensils that just simply can be rinsed in the water. But as we go on down to verse 16, then it gets more specific. It starts very general, and then it starts to get more specific down in the chapter. We have in verse 16, if a man has a seminal emission, he is to bathe his entire body in water. So then it's clearly using this language that's very clear, shichvat zara, which is referring to this seminal emission, this emission of seed zara. And so at that point, it's very clear that it's talking about that. Otherwise, it would be redundant to repeat that again in the text. And then we see that clothing and leather, it can be washed. It doesn't have to be destroyed. So that's another issue of kosher there. And then verse 18, after it deals with a man's seminal emission, then it goes even specific, and then it actually speaks about sexual relations. In verse 18, if a man goes to bed with a woman and has sexual relations, so v'isha asher ishchav ish otah shichvat zara. So the language there is that if a man, which he will lie down with her, has a seminal emission. So it's actually very clearly speaking of the sexual act that's taking place there. And it says that they wash themselves in water and be unclean until evening. So a lot of these offerings, or rather, a lot of these situations where one would become unclean, not all of them have offerings associated with them. You just simply have to wash, and you'll be unclean until evening. Right. So these are things that are very practical for today, even though we know that the ultimate scope is verse 31, down at the bottom there, when it deals with the Mishkan. But these are things that can actually be practiced today, and you can actually maintain ritual cleanliness in a lot of different situations, although not all, right? Because we do have situations where if, for example, in verse 13, if he has a chronic discharge, and verse 13 says when a person with a discharge has become free of it, he has to count 7 days for his purification. So this is the same as the woman in Edah. The standards are the same. Then he has to wash his clothes and bathe his body in running water. After that, he will be clean. But it's a little more tricky than the normal, uncleanliness. As compared to somebody that might have been made unclean by somebody else, like by sitting on his bed, right?
Yeah, they're like basically the hub of it all.
The source of the uncleanliness, so they just require a little bit more. So that in that particular case, you do have an offering that has to be made.
So
In verse 14.
is there a way maybe to open up this verse 11 a little bit, because it says, if the person with the discharge fails to rinse his hands in water before touching someone. All right, before we go any further, what if he doesn't fail to rinse his hands in water? So what if the person with the discharge rinses their hands in water, now they touch someone?
This I have often thought about this one. It's a very curious one. I've read a number of different commentaries that pretty much come up with the same conclusion as I have, which makes sense to me.
Connecting it to like the end of the day, or connecting it to the rinsing themselves. They're considered clean.
It seems
but
pretty
at evening still.
Well. It seems pretty straightforward, but it just doesn't. It doesn't quite explain why why there's an exception.
It begs the question. What if they did rinse their hands and then they touch someone?
Well, if we read the text, here's what it says. Again, let's read the text again. If the person with a discharge fails to rinse his hands in water before touching someone, so that's in the case that he fails to rinse them, that person is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening.
But normally you could read this verse. It says if they touch someone, then they have to do this. But if the person fails to rinse their hands, so why did they? I mean, it sounds like a little extra verse that just kind of was thrown in there.
Well,
it kind of opens up a little can of
I was about to say through deductive reasoning, it seems
if they rinse their hands, then it's okay to touch someone. That's what it sounds like.
That's what it is saying. That's exactly what it's saying.
So
there's no other way to interpret.
But it's not. I know, but it's not saying what kind of discharge, because it doesn't seem to make a difference here.
Yeah.
And it doesn't say that they had to wait until evening after they rinsed their hands either.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what type of discharge it is.
It doesn't say that their discharge stopped or that it had ended. It just says if they.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it doesn't matter if the person with the discharge, if it stopped or not. What the context is that.
So it sounds like they can touch people if they rinse their hands, even with a discharge.
Yeah, and that's the part that seems like that's hard to understand. But that is what it's saying. It's interesting.
Yeah.
So if you touch them, or you sit on something or come into contact with something that they've transferred their ritual uncleanliness or their uncleanliness to, you become unclean. But the curious part is, if they wash their hands and they touch you, somehow you don't become unclean.
Yeah.
God's smarter than I am. I don't know. But it is what it says. So
Right.
It's just one of those little passages that I can't really explain. But as I've looked at it, it's like that's all you can get from it. There's no other explanation. It's kind of mysterious. I'm sure that there's a spiritual aspect about that. I haven't really. Hasn't been revealed to me what that is yet, though.
Just from this chapter alone, it almost makes a person wonder if anybody is clean these days, or depending on the age of a person. They could be perpetually unclean. If they're young newlyweds, they could be perpetually unclean, and from sun up to sundown.
I personally believe that probably a lot of people are, because here's the thing. Although it says Mayim Chaim, it refers to living water that's moving. I think strictly, although we traditionally understand that to be a river or lake or even a man-made mikveh, the point is that the water is moving. It's carrying the impurities from point A to point B. It's moving it. And so I would technically consider, although I'm sure someone would want to quibble me on this, I would consider a shower to be technically Mayim Chaim, based on that definition. Because it is carrying, it's moving the water. It's moving your impurities from point A to point B. Mm-hmm. So if we understand what things will keep you unclean unless there's an offering, there's only a few of those things, right? So obviously, if a woman becomes, she has birth or she has her time of nidah, and then because there's a question later on in the chapter, whether there's an offering for a woman that goes to Neidah. And most commentators say no. It refers to the woman that has an exceptionally long period that goes way over the time that it's normally supposed to. Then there's an offering, is what it seems the text is saying. But there seems to be a little bit of a question there on that. So even with a woman that had a Neidah, because you can imagine a woman having to go up to the temple and give an offering every single month. That would be quite a burden, you know. But if God said to do it, of course we'd do it. But I just don't think that's what the text says. But so you have a woman that gives birth. You have a person that has a chronic discharge. They've got a disease of some sort, you know. You got, you know, obviously the Metzorah, but there wasn't a whole lot of those around. The lepers. You know, and you know, other than that, you have the man that, you know, happens to be going to bed, you know, and then his wife, you know, the blood gets on him. I think that the text says an offering. So, unless you were exposed to some of those things, the moment you took your shower or you took a jump in the lake or the river, and evening hit, you would be clean. You'd be ritually clean. So unless you touch a dead body, you know, or something of that nature, and which most people haven't done, you know.
If it doesn't say, you know, running water, then it doesn't require running water. If it says, like 18 says, bathe themselves in the water.
Yeah.
You know.
But remember, there's a definite article there, so it's referring to something definite. It's just not just water. Just bathe yourself in water. It's bamain. It's in the water. And so when you take a look at, when you know there's a definite article, you have to refer back to what the water is speaking of. And all throughout this text we have the mention of Mayim Chaim. Again, where would they be bathing in water?
I think raising doves and pigeons would be a lucrative business.
Turtle doves and pigeons.
Yeah, you're right. They did make a lot of money. Unfortunately, some of them abused it, as we saw with Yeshua. You know, when he came into the Beit HaMikdash during Pesach, and you know, you have this normal cleansing of your house during Pesach. This is what he was doing at his father's house, because they were filling with sin and greed and theft, because they would overcharge. They would abuse people, especially the Gentiles. The Gentiles got the brunt of it when they went to come bring an offering. It's like, oh, there's a Gentile. We're going to charge you extra.
So I guess if a person had a tendency, or you know, say you lived in a home where discharge was maybe common or often, you'd definitely avoid having clay vessels. You would probably want to just have, you know, and maybe you'd have. And I guess I was starting to read here, you know, in verse 26, where it talked about, let's see, every bed wherein she lies on all the days of her discharge shall be to her as the bed of her period.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I almost get the idea that maybe a woman had a particular bed, maybe in a room that she would go to for that, because it sounds like this is the bed of her Neidah. So this is where she'll be. So if she has it, keeps going on, then it'll be like that bed. And it doesn't sound like maybe she has two beds. You know, one for the.
It's a possibility. Yeah, it's a possible. You know, obviously, depending on your means, you could have a second room specifically set aside for that, and I believe that some did. But then again, you have people that are not as wealthy, that don't have more than, you know, the rooms that they just live in all the time. And you probably had a lot of people that was the case. Where you just have to make do, you know. You know, for example, when Nessa goes through her, you know, normal time of Neidah, or she's in a state of uncleanliness, but I want to practice this as much as I possibly can, so I just go sleep somewhere else. And she goes to that period, the bedding's washed, so on and so forth, and then I will sleep in it again once it's, you know, technically considered ritually clean again, according to the Torah. And that's how I handle it. We don't have she doesn't have a separate bed. It's just that we just do what's necessary, you know, to observe it. But you know, so I think it just so on that note, I think there's several ways you could do this, and in several ways they probably will have done it all throughout history. But it would be definitely convenient if you had a separate Nida room. You know?
Yeah. I saw,
But big Hebrew letters, Nida.
I saw a book in the library about a year or so back, and it was like, one of the popular books for the months that were there, and it was called like The Red Tent, and it was like the story of a Jewish woman, how, in history, there was a particular place where women went during that time.
Yeah.
And it existed,
Well, if you had a tent, it would be easy enough to pop something up,
It existed continually, so, just kind of separated.
Yeah, so some did practice that. But just knowing how things go in life,
Right.
And as you read in the Mishnah and the Talmud, there's just so much expression. And you get one expression that's propped up and said this is what it's kind of done, but then you more research, you find out people are doing this all kinds of things, just like people do.
Would you say that the Kohanim were basically like the doctors in the community, or physicians?
In a lot of cases, yeah, you'll see that with just in more of the ancient rabbis too. A lot of them are doctors. Although at the same time, the doctors were needed. It was a love-hate relationship. They loved the doctors and they hated the doctors. There's a lot of negative things said in the Mishnah and Talmud about doctors. But yeah, the Kohanim obviously were some of the main physicians, when it came to Torah law and what was being prescribed. But the women got pretty good at that type of stuff too, and learning all those remedies and. But to be a doctor, it would take substantial mental faculties. And so often it went hand in hand with some of these sages and rabbis, because they would be selected because of their mental faculties. And so it would just make sense that some of them would start to learn some of these other trades. And they often did. They usually had some type of a trade along with. And there's never other social factors that went into that, I think, too, because often to be trained as a rabbi, from ancient of times, even to today, you would have to have some type of substantial financial means to be able to get that quality study, to sit up the feet of a known rabbi, and tutelage, it would cost somebody something. So not everybody could do it, and oftentimes it was one of the firstborn, or again, it would change. It would change depending on the family, what was going on, and that particular individual and his potential. But with that being said, if somebody would have that means to be trained in that way, it would also cost, not just anybody could be trained as a doctor. You would either enslave yourself, in a sense, to learn a trade, in some of the ancient times, or you had a substantial amount of money where you could pay for that learning and that teaching. So some of those skill sets that kind of ran in similar packs, I guess you could say, because of the financial means.
I guess a person with a laundry service could also be well-to-do.
Yeah, exactly right.
But you almost get the sense here that people didn't have like 10 sets of clothes, a closet full. Sounds like they had just the clothes on them, and they had maybe one or two undergarments.
Mm-hmm.
So then when they would wash their clothes, it was like, it takes up your day to do all this, wash your clothes, to bathe yourself. And then basically you're just kind of waiting until evening before you can join the community or your family again. So it sounds like...
They had servants, though.
You think so?
Some of them probably did. I guess it probably just depended on the family.
Like all the, when they came into the land, then there were certain groups of people that became
Woodcutters, things like that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you do have some of that as they went into the land. But personal... It probably would depend on the family if they had their personal servants, in the home that would just do their basic stuff, But yeah, I think the average person probably wouldn't have a ton of change of clothing, but they probably would have a few, and it would take it'd take time to do some of that.
When I read verse 21, it says, whoever touches her bed, okay, whoever, the husband, maybe the child that
Sure,
lives
yeah.
in the house.
Mm-hmm.
Oops, guess you gotta go wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and
Yep.
you're unclean until.
Yep, and as long as you weren't going to go to the Mishkan, it's no big deal.
Yeah. So I guess some of these particular verses, because you think about it, a priest or Levite was not necessarily someone who, just sat around at the Mishkan all day long. They had normal lives, they had homes, and
Yeah, they have different divisions and schedules in which they've served.
Yeah, so if it was your week to serve, you'd be like,
Starting up on Leviticus chapter 15.
Yeah, you'd be like, all right, nothing's going to go wrong here. Maybe I'm going to get a tent over here.
You would be very careful, yeah. You would, all of this would be like right in the forefront of your mind. Leviticus 15 would all be at the forefront. You'd want to be very careful. And when you're living in a society where everybody's aware of this, then it goes a little bit more smoother. It's not as difficult, as it might be if everybody's just all learning it all at once, and it's completely new and foreign. It would just be like clockwork, The woman would know which vessels not to touch, and know, how to conduct herself, it probably would depend. How they handled themselves probably would dependent on how their proximity of the Beit HaMikdash, too, because let's just say they lived 100 miles away from the Mishkan or the temple, and it's likely that not a whole lot of people are going to be rendered unclean, and then unknowingly go into the temple. They may not have everything as separate and as sterile. Although they would follow the instructions, they may not have a separate red tent. In that particular case, they may just just observe a general separation and cleanse everything according to the Torah, knowing that there's just they're outside of that sphere of people that are going to be coming through, and even if they did, they'd be like, hey, we have some uncleanness. If we know that Uncle Shlomo is going to be going up to the temple, it's like let's do something a little different. But
it sounds like, because of the emphasis in verse 31, that all the other verses up to that point, all the washings of the clothes, in the water, and waiting till evening to become clean again, everything that leads up to verse 31 sounds like it's not going to be a death situation.
no, it's not.
Sounds like there's grace there, and
Yeah.
Hashem is not, it's just when he gets to the tabernacle.
That's the main point.
So
Yeah, that's the main point.
and if you just avoid that,
Yeah, so while we want to
separate yourself,
exactly, that's the main thing. And so while we want to generally practice those things today, if somebody happens to be unclean and has the ability to transmit uncleanliness, I don't think there's going to be any, when it comes to the issue of fellowship, should I stay home for the next couple weeks and not have fellowship? Should I not come to synagogue? No. That's where I would draw the line on the observance, because you're gonna have a hard time defiling the temple in Spokane, Washington, especially. Not only is there not a temple, but even if you had the concern that you were going to go take a trip to the Temple Mount and then somehow defile that holy area, in Spokane, you're gonna have a hard time doing that. But if let's just say you were in Yerushalayim, I would just steer clear of that area, and you're still gonna be pretty safe. But I would not let it get in the way of fellowship. Some have said, well, should I just bring a pillow for my wife, so she can sit on, and it's like, I don't think there's even the necessity to embarrass your wife in front of everybody. I think we should practice as much as possible in private and in our home. that apart from that, there is no sin taking place whatsoever. The only sin that would be if we jump down to chapter 20, and a man has sexual relations with his wife, and she deliberately and he deliberately uncovers the flow of blood and has relations. That would be, that God takes that quite seriously. That would be a sin for sure. But that's completely different than what we're reading here in chapter 15.
Right. In a few more weeks, we'll get to that.
Yeah, exactly. Any other thoughts on chapter 15?
Definitely a straightforward chapter for the most part.
Yeah, it seems to be. There's that one little verse that's like, so you can touch me if you have clean hands? And I mean still clean? How does that work? I don't know, but apparently it
Well,
does.
like you said, it's what it says.
Yeah.
I guess if you wanted to, you could try to add more definition, but then what would you be doing? You'd be adding to the Torah.
Exactly. We always have to be careful about
This is
that.
what it says.
Especially when it just, you don't have much explanation, you know. But I think that's, you know, once we nail down the literal understanding of it, the application, then I think that, you know, we have a little bit of room, as long as we don't abandon that literal understanding, to take a look at some of the spiritual aspects, you know, of that. What is the spiritual application or the side of this person with the discharge who is unclean, who as long as he cleans his hands, can touch somebody else and not make them unclean? What's the spiritual application of that? I don't know. I think we probably have to be careful, because I can already see that that could give it a dangerous understanding. But
I think that, you know, when you think about it, once a person becomes clean, then they're clean. Now, I used to always wonder, you know, because Yeshua would touch a lot of people in various stages of who knows what, you know, they weren't well.
Mhm.
Maybe they were unclean, who knows, but we just know that when he was done, they were clean.
Right.
So it's almost like it's a moot point then, you know, because now they're clean. So, you know, but the instant that he touched them, you know, they were not clean, but now they're clean. So, you know, it's almost like, you know, as it was about to be, it's clean, you know.
Well, first of all, like, I think that Yeshua is, you know, the source of Mayim Chaim. You know, he is the Mayim Chaim, so he can't make Mayim Chaim unclean at all. But even so, I kind of imagine that as he's going to touch the person, he has like this clean force field around his finger, and it's just everything that's getting into its sphere is turning clean. And so as he's touching, he's never actually touching anything that's, I don't know,
Well,
unclean. Everything he touches becomes clean, you know.
Just like the woman who had the issue of, you know, like in this chapter, a woman who has an issue beyond the normal period. This woman had it for 10 or 12 years, whatever it was. And in an instant, she knew that she was healed.
Right.
And he noticed something happened.
Power went out.
Yeah. So, you know, she touched somebody. So if you take this chapter, anything she touches becomes unclean, but she couldn't touch him in a way that would make him unclean because, like you said, there's this, you know, mind pain that's coming out of him. So,
Right, yeah.
So it was, you know, that's something you could maybe read into, but I think.
And even if it did make him technically unclean, of course it wouldn't be a sin. We don't really establish that.
Right.
But, you know, he would just simply go and clean his clothing and avoid the temple for an evening, and he'd be clean again, you know. The one thing I was thinking about is, you know, maybe more this may become significant, where if someone washes their hands, if they're technically unclean themselves, but they wash their hands, it does not impart uncleanliness if they do that. let's just say that you have a Cohen, right? Because obviously this is the book of Leviticus, right? The Levites, obviously they're teaching this to the people, but this is first and foremost for their understanding, so they can properly handle themselves in the holy place and so on and so forth. But let's just say that they're handling some of these people with these sicknesses, like you were mentioning about them kind of being the doctors and examining these people, giving prescriptions, and maybe, at least very least giving the Torah prescription of what to do. And yet they're touching these people, and according to this text, they become unclean themselves. Now, of course, that would preclude them from going to the tabernacle. But if they were examining them outside that area, a place where, because it doesn't say the priests had to examine these people in the Mishkan, right, area. They could examine them outside this area, and they could do so in a way that, although they may probably be becoming ritually unclean themselves to do that, as long as they wash their hands, they did the Netilat Yadayim, they're washing of the hands, and, that they could continue to examine people without imparting cleanliness to each person. I don't know. That's just maybe an application to that.
I heard something that the red heifer had, in order to purify the
Temple.
temple,
Yeah.
it had a red heifer.
Yes.
But the person that is doing that has to be ritually.
Mm-hmm. And then after he handles that and the ashes and things of that nature, he actually becomes unclean. Then he has to go through the process.
So even if the temple was rebuilt,
Mm-hmm.
and even if it had a red heifer, how would the person be ritually clean to offer them?
Well, it's a good question. If they have not done anything that would require sacrifice, all they would have to do is make sure that everything that they're wearing and they themselves have been bathed in Mayim Chaim and that have been cleansed and have waited until the evening if there was any possible issue. And then they could come ritually clean before and make an offering. The only exception to that would be, guys, knock it off. The only exception to that would be if they touch a dead body. Then they do require the ashes of the red heifer to cleanse them. That's specific to that case. But in any case, they would just simply go through that in this cleansing process that we read about in chapter 15. Of course, to do any of that, if you have to come and bring an offering, they're two separate issues. The Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, has to be cleansed, has to be ritually purified before any of that whole service can take place in the first place. But that's separate from the person. After that's taken place, if they're ritually clear, then they come and bring their offering, no problem. The ashes of the red heifer is only really dealing with, I think, specifically with the person if they had touched a dead body. Which I've done. So technically, until I'm cleansed with the ashes of the red heifer, I would never be able to do that. But I don't think the majority of people have had that situation on their hands, where they've done that. But that's something that's definitely on my mind, and it'll be the first thing I'll be seeking to do. I will not presume that God's just going to say, "Oh, don't worry about that. That was a long time ago."
Oh, water under the bridge, right?
Yeah. No, I'm going to do what I know the Torah tells me to do. That's a really good question. Well, should we close in prayer?
Father, we give you thanks for this time of study, and help us to see how this applies into our lives today, how we're to be clean before you, and how we're to keep these lessons in our mind, in our heart, and even preparing for the future when things like this have become once again renewed and revived in Yerushalayim, and wherever you put us. May we just know that it's important that we don't just gloss over these scriptures, but that we read them all and that we take them to heart and we hide them in our hearts so that we don't profane your temple, your sanctuary. That's what we want to keep in our heart and our mind. That we're always seeking to do what's right and holy and just in what your Torah tells us. So may this be our heart's desire and all that we say and do, and may you keep us safe throughout this evening in Yeshua's name. Amen.
Amen. On the note of the red heifer, I'm not sure if you've recently seen any articles on that, but they recently just certified and acquired another kosher red heifer, which is always significant because they don't come up very often. And so when you have that available, then you have a window of opportunity. It really is a short window of opportunity to, because once they start developing a gray hair or two, or you get a simple defect, you can't use it anymore. They can't be offered and turned into ashes for all that. But when you have that available, it's a window of opportunity to actually establish the Beit HaMikdash and get it going. You know? So there, because of course, Judaism.
They can't obtain the ashes of the heifer until they have a temple.
Well, they have everything in place they need. They have the Kohanim. They have all the holy utensils.
They don't have the temple itself.
Right. That's right.
So they couldn't do the ashes. They don't have the next steps to go.
Yeah, but once that's all in place. What I'm trying to say is that would you? But they wanted to. They could. You know, for example, they've tried to rush in the capstone a few times for the temple. They get the building process going. But yeah, they would have everything they would need to do that. You know. Yeah. So, but this is something that obviously before Mashiach, reestablishes and builds the temple again, as the Ezekiel places clearly say he will. This is a prerequisite for him to be able to do that. So, granted, God could just be like, boom, red heifer. Could just like miraculously have one just standing there.
I'm sure he will make it
but
when it's necessary.
But I have a feeling he's going to do it how he usually has done all throughout history. They simply have one born and go through the selection process.